What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our tight end rankings for week 12 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, number one overall, no surprise here. We've got Travis Kelce against the Rams. Travis Kelce, your tight end one on the season. Nothing to really debate here. 35.5 fantasy points in week 11. His season high, 3 touchdowns, 115 receiving yards, 6 receptions off of 10 targets. If you own Kelce, there's no doubt about it. Kelce's your starting tight end. Kelce's our tight end one as we approach the week. At this point, there's an argument for Kelce to be drafted number 1 overall. That's how much value he has brought to your respective fantasy team. So, moving right along, we've got Mark Andrews coming in as your tight end 2 so far on the season. He gets the Jacksonville Jaguars, a pretty favorable matchup, a good game script here. 12.3 fantasy points in week 11, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 63 receiving yards. Should be another good outing for Mark Andrews, who looks to be fully healthy. This is Lamar Jackson's number 1 option, no doubt about it. So Andrews comes in as our tight end 2. Really no surprise with your top 2 guys. All right, I've got Hawkinson as our tight end 3. He is coming in as our tight end 3 so far on the season as well. He gets the New England Patriots, who have a very good defense, but the weakest part of this defense is their ability to cover the tight end position. They give up a lot of points to the tight end position from a fantasy perspective. So I think that Hawkinson will definitely be that security blanket for Kirk Cousins and the Minnesota Vikings as they try to bounce back from a poor offensive performance in week 11. His volume has looked very good since he's joined the Vikings. I don't expect that to change at all. Number 4 overall, I've got George Kittle, who I really liked going into week 11. We had him as our tight end 2. He absolutely showed out, but he gets a tough matchup against the New Orleans Saints, who have played very well against the tight end position so far on the season. In week 11 against the Arizona Cardinals, 24.4 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 84 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. That was a season high in terms of fantasy points. George Kittle, regardless of the matchup, just holds far too high of a ceiling to consider ranking any lower as we approach the week. All right, I've got David Njoku number 5 overall because he has a very favorable matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This is a unit that has given up a lot of fantasy points to the tight end position. I know he didn't play very well in week 11, but I always try to give players a grace game when they return from injury, so we will kind of scratch week 11 against the Buffalo Bills off of the board. I think that Njoku will bounce back against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers here in week 12. All right, number 6 overall, I've got Pat Freiermuth going up against the Indianapolis Colts. He comes in as your tight end 7 so far on the season. You guys know that I've been a huge fan of Pat Freiermuth. He has just been really underrated throughout the season and extremely consistent. 15.9 fantasy points in week 11, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 79 receiving yards. The Steelers are just going to continuously be in game scripts where they need to throw the football, and Pat Freiermuth is that perfect security blanket for Kenny Pickett. I think he has another good outing against the Colts. All right, next up, I've got Gerald Everett going up against the Arizona Cardinals. You could even argue that just due to the matchup alone, Gerald Everett should be higher, but he did miss week 11. I think he'll be good to go from everything I've read in week 12. Regardless, the Cardinals are the worst team in the entire league against the tight end position. Everett should have a good outing and see enough volume to put up a very good stat line and have a very safe floor as we approach week 12. All right, Tyler Higbee is essentially your number 1, potentially number 2 receiving option behind Allen Robinson for the Rams. The bigger issue for the Rams is who is the quarterback going to be here in week 12, but a solid outing against the Saints in week 11 with 8.5 fantasy points, 45 receiving yards after having 15.3 fantasy points in week 10. It's a good matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs defense, but I do worry, even if the volume is good, I don't know if Higbee has a crazy high ceiling, but ultimately he's your tight end 9 so far on the season. Ultimately, I just worry about who is going to be throwing Higbee the football throughout the game, but we'll put him as tight end 8 as we approach the season. All right, since week 6 of the season, Dawson Knox has 9 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 9. So he's really been stepping it up. He had his best fantasy performance of the season in week 11 against the Cleveland Browns with 14 fantasy points, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 70 receiving yards, and he gets a very, very favorable matchup against the Detroit Lions on Thanksgiving Day. I like Dawson Knox a lot this week. He might not be rostered in your fantasy leagues, so go out and check. He has been dropped in a lot of 10-man leagues and even in some 12-man leagues, so go check because he's a very solid streaming option against the Detroit Lions here in week 12. All right, Dalton Schultz came in a little bit lower just due to some of the matchups of the tight ends we just went over, but I still think Schultz, even if he had a tough week in week 11 with just 5.2 fantasy points, will bounce back on Thanksgiving Day against the Giants. Since Dak Prescott and Schultz have come back healthy, he's had 9 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 11 like we just talked about. So I think he'll bounce back against the Giants, but ultimately the tight ends that we just went over either have shown a little bit more significant volume or have better matchups overall. So Schultz, who I still have a lot of faith in, comes in as our tight end 10 as we approach week 12. All right, number 11 overall is Juwan Johnson, who you could definitely argue could be higher on the list. If it was not for the matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, who have played well against the position so far on the season, one of the top teams against the tight end position on the season, Juwan Johnson would be a lot higher. He's your tight end 8 so far on the season, and it has not mattered if Jameis Winston's the quarterback or Andy Dalton is the quarterback. They both have chemistry with Johnson, and the way that Dalton played last week, even if he played awful in week 10 and awful in week 9, he is going to be the starting quarterback according to head coach Dennis Allen, and probably deservedly so, I guess, for going off week 11, which they beat the Rams in, right? Let's face it, the Rams have also played very good against the tight end position, and Juwan Johnson still had 47 receiving yards off of 3 receptions and a receiving touchdown for 13.7 fantasy points against them. Since week 7 of the season, he has had 12 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for week 8 against the Raiders. I'm a huge fan of Juwan Johnson. He's only 30% rostered right now. He needs to be rostered in much more leagues. That's probably going to change from the time I'm recording this, from the time you guys watch this, because waivers will have gone through. But seriously, he's your tight end 8 so far on the season. He's been phenomenal. He is a tight end to go after pretty aggressively, and a tight end we can still stream, although he has a tough matchup. All right, Hayden Hurst is my tight end 12 as we approach week 12 of the season, and he is the tight end 12 overall in fantasy football right now. Disappointing week in week 11 with 4.8 fantasy points, just 2 receptions for 28 receiving yards. But, Hurst is not necessarily a ceiling type player. He just brings you a safe floor pretty consistently. Last week we didn't see it. Not the greatest matchup against the Titans, not the worst matchup. So I think that Hurst fits in pretty good at tight end 12. All right, Foster Moreau is my next tight end up. He disappointed in week 11 as a streaming option with just 4.3 fantasy points, 33 receiving yards. But the Seahawks are one of the worst teams in the entire league against the tight end position from a fantasy perspective. So I think that Foster Moreau is a strong streaming option this week and presents a really good opportunity against the Seattle Seahawks. So I've got him as tight end 13. All right, I had some faith in Greg Dulcich last week against the Raiders, but he gave us just 7 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 30 receiving yards. A pretty decent matchup against the Panthers here in week 14. I think that Greg Dulcich fits in pretty nicely as our tight end 14, as there's still some inconsistency and some uncertainty and just not a lot of boom when we look at this Broncos offense, but I still like Greg Dulcich. I have some faith in him. All right, Evan Ingram comes in as our tight end 15. With the way he's played overall in the season, you could argue he could be a little bit higher. He was on bye week in week 11, but in his last 2 matchups, he's had 4.4 or less fantasy points. Going up against the Ravens, this should be a game where Trevor Lawrence is relying on Evan Ingram, so it should be a pretty favorable game script for him. But with the last 2 matchups, I'm a little bit worried about Ingram, who really had a good point in the season between weeks 5 and 8, scoring 9 or more fantasy points in each of those weeks. So Ingram moves down to tight end 15 as we move into the week, but I do think he's got a good opportunity overall. All right, 16th overall, I've got Cole Kmet. He definitely has moved back very significantly in our rankings heading into this specific week. The number one issue is that we don't know if Justin Fields is going to play in this game or not. We got an asterisk here because if Justin Fields does suit up, then Cole Kmet definitely moves up in the rankings. But looking at the next issue, this Jets defense is pretty darn good. It's not a great matchup for Cole Kmet. And then we look at week 11 against the Falcons, which was a beautiful matchup. He didn't do a lot in that game, right? Just 3 receptions, 35 receiving yards, 6.5 fantasy points, when in the prior 3 weeks he had between 9.1 and 23.4 fantasy points in each respective matchup. He's still your tight end 11 on the season. I still have faith in Cole Kmet, but I don't necessarily have faith in an offense led by Trevor Siemian when we've seen what Justin Fields brings to the table. So, like I said, guys, if Fields is able to suit up, Kmet is still an option. If he does not, I am not really a fan of Kmet unless you absolutely don't have better options. All right, Austin Hooper has shown us some life in his last 2 matchups. 9.1 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games. 19.6 points in week 11. 2 touchdowns in week 11. With Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, it looks like he is looking for Austin Hooper when he can find him. So I think it's a good game script against the Bengals. I think that Hooper will be active again within this game. Not the most consistent tight end on the season here, tight end 25 overall. So I'm not exactly ready to trust Hooper, but if we look at the trend as of late, he is a tight end we can consider if you're absolutely desperate. All right, 18th overall, I've got Logan Thomas of the Washington Commanders in a good matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. 11.5 fantasy points in week 11 for Logan Thomas. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 65 receiving yards. A good matchup, but it's worth noting when we look at him on the season, he only has 1 other double-digit fantasy performance with some injuries in the middle, and in week 10 he had just 3.2 fantasy points. He's your tight end 34, so there's a lot of inconsistency here. But if we look at last week, we look at this week's matchup, I think he deserves to be in the top 20. All right, 19th overall, I've got Robert Tonyan, who should have a pretty good opportunity in terms of game script and playing from behind against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 12. And overall, he's your tight end 16 on the season, but the last 3 weeks have just been really bad. 5.9 or less fantasy points. He is completely touchdown dependent, I would argue. I mean, outside of week 6 where he had 90 receiving yards, he doesn't have another double-digit fantasy performance except in week 4 where he did score a touchdown. So not a great matchup for Robert Tonyan, but the Packers should be forced to throw the football within this matchup, which could benefit Tonyan. And since he's our tight end 16 on the season, he still makes the top 20 for the week. All right, Cade Otton is my final tight end here to wrap things up, our tight end 20 as we approach week 12 of this season. Overall, I still have some faith in Cade Otton. He's been pretty inconsistent since week 5. His stat lines read 10.3, 4.3, 10.4, 3.5, 17.8, and 6.5. He was on bye week in week 11. He's due for a good game. He's definitely shown enough chemistry with Tom Brady to be, in my eyes, considered the tight end 1 for the Buccaneers. At this point, when we look at the remaining options, there's not a lot of consistency. So I think that Cade Otton is worth a shot if you're absolutely desperate as we approach week 12. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.